On behalf of the Interact Media Defined Group, I'd like to thank you, Garth, for giving us this opportunity in your capacity as Acting Chief Executive Officer of the South African Bureau of Standards to look at the progress that's been made. We'd like this to be positive. Dwelling in the past is good if you're going to learn something about it in the future, but let's also look at the unenviable task that you and your team have had to look at. And our first question is really appreciating the need, as was stated in the press release, financial sustainability and legislative compliance. Can you please describe how the SABS will provide assurance to its customers who are very negative and suffered financial losses due to the past inability to obtain certificates sooner than later, that the SABS is actually going to get this right?
Thank you very much, Rory, and thanks for the opportunity. If I may say so on behalf of SABS, to apologize to all the SABS clients firstly, where clients have maybe been placed in a very difficult position because of the poor delivery of the suite of SABS services in the recent period. The second point, I think, is to recognize that the institution is in distress, and that distress manifests itself at the level of financial sustainability, at the level of governance, management, and operations. We've put in place a short-term turnaround strategy. As everybody is aware, the SABS was placed under administration by the Minister during July, and subsequently we've put in place a short-term strategy. But let me make the point that to fix an institution which is in distress in the way in which SABS is, requires a much longer-term strategy. However, the short-term strategy, we think, is already yielding positive results. We have reinstated the moratorium which was placed on customer-specific requirement testing or partial testing. Obviously, that's got to be rolled out in an incremental way. We are filling 60 mission-critical posts, especially scientific posts in the testing, conformity assessment, certification arena. We are putting in place a strategy to ensure that there is a single point of entry for customers, whether it's with respect to complaints, services, billing, and so on and so forth, all of which is going to rest on a stronger digital platform. We are already refurbishing existing laboratory capabilities where these have been allowed to fall into a state where refurbishment and maintenance was far behind. The South African Bureau of Standards received a disclaimer from the Auditor General because of approximately 50 million rand a year budget or deficits, and so we've put in place a cost compliance strategy at the same time as a revenue generation strategy linked to client centricity, client retention, growing the business in the suite of services that are provided, to ensure that the difficult task of returning the institution to financial sustainability, which combines the 100 million approximately that's received on an annual basis off the public purse, the fiscus, as well as revenue which is generated by the services that are provided by SABS. I think there's something of an anomaly which I'm trying to address. There's this anomaly that standard setting and the management of South African national standards is a public good, and certification and testing isn't. In my view, they are all a public good, and they should be funded by a combination of transfers from the fiscus and the shareholder, which is the Department of Trade and Industry, and revenue generated by providing a quality, globally competitive service to industry, manufacturing in particular, in the standards, certification and testing arena. And getting that right is going to take time. So I think the administrators are driven by first the principle of honesty. It's an institution in distress. We can't bluff anybody. Everybody knows, especially the clients, that there are problems. How do we fix those in the short term? How do we put in place a longer term strategy? And we've got to do that in a fiscally or financially prudent way, so that we don't that we can ensure financial sustainability. And the last thing in this regard is that, apart from apologizing to clients, I think we need to say, let's work together. How do we develop a collaborative approach which honestly addresses the shortcomings and the weaknesses in SABS and works together with our clients and to develop a shared vision of what must and can be done, because the industrial effort, or the effort to reindustrialize South Africa, especially in circumstances which are not getting easier, with the fourth or digital industrial revolution, massive disruptive technology which is already with us. It's got to be about a shared effort, including, by the way, with other private sector institutions which provide testing of one sort or another, because we've got to move out of a defensive stance to one which says, how do we collaborate, how do we work together, how do we not seek to hide our shortcomings, but put them squarely on the table with a view to resolving them.
Thanks, Ross. The one point in your comment there about let's do it all together, shared effort and that. Is there anything in place now to start that? You have a huge client base, and I would hope a growing client base, all things being equal. How would you plan to do that? Because that's quite a huge task.
Led by the administrators and myself and the executive, we've already engaged in a exhaustive customer client engagement exercise. So let me give you two examples. We were faced with a situation where the South African Paint Manufacturers Association were going to cut their linkages with SABS. We met the industry association. Simultaneously, we addressed their needs and invested in the testing capabilities for paint. We then arranged for SAPMA to visit the laboratory to assess the capital investment that we've done and whether it could meet their standards. We've ensured that the technicians who are responsible for the paint testing laboratory have received training and meet the necessary requirements to undertake the testing. and we have met not only the paint manufacturers as industry association, but had bilateral meetings with the 100-odd, or some of the 100-odd paint manufacturers and producers that they are in South Africa. This is a difficult task. We've got to restore confidence. We've got to ensure that the necessary capabilities are in place in SABS, which is going to take time and be incremental, and we've got to make sure that a customer management relations system is in place, so that there's one port of call in SABS which deals with requests for services, handles billing and accounting issues adequately and properly, and ensures that complaints are addressed. So an institution which has different divisions from standards, certification, testing, enterprise development and design, the failure often in an institution like this is that clients have to speak not to one entry point to resolve their problems, but end up speaking to 5, and the call center shifts them from pillar to post. It's an administrative hurdle for the clients. They often don't get satisfaction. They are understandably irritated. And so it's about a combination of rebuilding confidence, putting in place the correct systems, including digitally loaded systems, as well as being able to provide the requisite professional level of service, and finally dealing with complaints, which, as I've said earlier, we don't want to be defensive about. We admit that there are problems. The critical thing in SABS is to ensure that our management, performance management, non-performance management, training, organizational development interventions ensure that we provide a professional, competent service. And there's no quick fix for that. It's going to take time. I'm convinced that there are women and men of both good faith, but of high technical and professional expertise in the institution. We can get it right after a number of years of decline, and we will get it right. It's going to take time. There's going to be ups and downs. We're going to get some things right. We've got to learn by doing, and we've got to learn by doing by having a non-defensive posture.
Just picking up your point again there on setting up all these sections to handle the different needs of the customer. In the short term, where do they go to in terms of getting answers quickly in this very short term period?
Well, there's a single call center in operation. That call center will delegate requests, complaints, and issues which arise. Those are monitored from point of entry to conclusion. We're putting in place a digital system and dashboard. It's going to take a few years before that's state of the art, but it's already in place. Where there is a lack of drawing any complaint or query to its conclusion satisfactorily, I've said to industry associations and companies, I've got an open door, let me know where, and we've got meetings this week and next week with companies where they haven't received satisfaction. I will personally meet with them, call in the appropriate managers responsible for this work. To the best of my knowledge, all the outstanding complaints have been dealt with. There's some which require longer term process. For example, where we don't have the requisite testing capabilities, it's going to take time to be able to respond to those problems. But we've given an undertaking, and I stand by this undertaking, that we'll address every single complaint, and customers and clients are welcome to get hold of my office, and I'll personally address those complaints. I'm not saying we're going to be able to deal with every single one to the satisfaction of the client, but we'll try our very best.
I appreciate the directness and honesty there on that one. The relationship with ISO. This is now onto the international stage, and is the idea, or what is the merit in taking the ISO standard and then adapting it to the South African standard in terms of time, in terms of it's been done before, so now let's make this happen a bit quicker than perhaps what it has been in the past.
You will be aware of the fact that SABS is one of the founding members of ISO, and we value the relationship with ISO and the Global Electrotechnical Institution, I think it's called the IEC, and we're absolutely determined to strengthen that relationship. I suppose the public needs to appreciate the fact that our standards are voluntary standards, and they become compulsory when they are become part of compulsory specifications or regulations. The second thing is, in keeping with a decline of capabilities across the institution, I am very mindful of the fact that there are suboptimal processes in our standards division. That relates to the turnaround times for standards, the operational technical committees, down to some of the detail like the minute taking and so on and so forth. I think it is insufficient to say that we are beholden to participation from industry experts, manufacturing companies, technical experts, academics, and so on and so forth, because that's an easy way out of the problem. We must make sure that the way in which we manage the technical committees, the way in which we ensure that technical experts, manufacturing companies, industry associations, and so on and so forth, see participation in the technical committees as very important for their companies, for the manufacturing sector and industry in South Africa as a whole, and that the regulatory burden of so doing is as limited as possible. It's behoven on SABS to make the process easy, rather than saying we are prisoners to the voluntary process and the participation of external stakeholders. That's my approach to the issue. We've got to get it right. We've got to improve the professional capabilities through interventions such as training in our standards division, get the technical committees working better, getting the minute takers, the editors, and so on and so forth better up to speed. That's going to take time, it's going to take training, and it's going to take changing the kind of organizational culture away from this approach which is sometimes adopted, which is, it's not our fault. Yeah. It may not be our fault, but we've got to make sure that it works much, much better than it is at the moment. I think, if I may add to this, I'm of the opinion, and I can't speak on behalf of the Minister of Trade and Industry, but my understanding is that he's given an instruction for a review of the 2008 Acts, which separated the National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications and the South African Bureau of Standards, to have something of a mid-term review. What has been the impact, both positive and negative? What is the existing policy, regulatory and operational status quo of the suite of technical infrastructure or SQAM institutions, SABS, the National Metrology Institute, the NRCS, and the accreditation body SANAS? What is the status quo and the impact of those SQAM institutions on the industrial effort? What are the unintended negative consequences? What's an optimal ecosystem of SQAM institutions? What are the best practices in other jurisdictions? Probably looking at one or two middle income countries rather than developed industrial countries. What is the best mix of these policy interventions, and how do we scale that up? So as we do, as we put in place a process to strengthen SABS, it's got to be in collaboration with the other technical or SQAM institutions, and we've got to ensure that an ecosystem of those institutions supports the industrial effort, because at the end of the day, unless we, at the risk of stating the obvious, get in place a set of supply and demand side instruments by government, whether it's incentives or public procurement to support local manufacturers, and an enabling technical infrastructure institution, then we won't create the requisite environment for the private sector to create wealth, grow jobs, absorb and diffuse technology, exports, and so on and so forth. And I know that's very high level, but actually that is something that the Minister has said we must do as a matter of urgency.
I think that's very good news, and a lot of the questions you have already answered. So I'm going to jump to your three plans. The first, the second, and the third plans that you're putting in place. A little bit of timelining on it. I said, you have said it's going to take a long time, but any idea of plan number one, plan number two, and plan number three in terms of putting some kind of timeline on it?
The administrators were appointed up to the 31st of January 2019. We have already put in place a short-term turnaround strategy, which involves immediate steps, which I've referred to, but at the risk of repeating myself, those include lifting the moratorium on customer-specific or partial testing, refurbishment and essential maintenance of testing laboratories, in tight financial circumstances, setting aside a very significant amount of money for upgrading testing laboratories. Fourthly, putting in place interventions to ensure at a management operational oversight level that the very significant problem related to expiring permits, which we know had a very deleterious impact on industry, never occurs again. That's a management issue. We've put the systems in place. And then creating this single platform for customer relations and management, that's already been put in place together with the stakeholder engagement. I've mentioned to you one example. There are many others that we are doing to literally meet clients and move to customer centricity. And so there's a short-term plan in place, but we've got to, and that has already been signed off by the Minister. We will have to report back to the Minister on the 31st of January whether that's been accomplished and what the outcomes of that are. Aside from the short-term plan, we will have by January a much longer-term plan in place, which is going to require long-term investment in the laboratory services to not only scale up existing services but meet much more technology intensive requirements for testing and new products. In the testing space, we have to align South Africa's industrial strategy to the capabilities and services that we provide. Let me give you one example. At the end of the day, South Africa is a mining company. Do we have standards and testing capabilities for upstream mining capital equipment? Probably there are very significant shortcomings. We are working with a group of experts to develop a system which is linked to product classification standards, supplier development, so that we begin to see standards as one important requirement in a much wider technologically driven set of other policy instruments which are increasingly coming to play. We can, as we speak, take, Rory, your cell phone and take a picture of a barcode on a product, and within 3 seconds get the product classification and traceability of that product. How do we link that to standards? And so the task before us as an institution is not getting easier. In fact, it's getting more difficult. We have to play in a competitive space where other service providers are providing conformity assessment services. We've got to ensure that we're up to speed. So I'm sorry to speak at length about this. Can I put a date to when we would say the longer term strategy is all in place? Difficult to do. What we've got to do and is build in SABS a much stronger research and strategy capability, so that the management interventions which I've described are built on the back of a clearer, certain alignment with the industrial strategy of government, which I'm confident in the years to come will become more focused and supported, And secondly, that our strategy is aligned to the huge, as I've said, technological and carbon mitigation, disruptive technologies that are coming down the road. It's important to be able to test chemicals and cement and piping and so on and so forth. But we've also got to get much higher up the value chain in relation to the services that we provide. That's a difficult job. We've got to learn by doing, and we've got to ensure that, and I've assigned specific responsibilities. If, as I'm sure it is, standards conformity assessment is critical to the industrial effort, we must be able to make the case to the government, which is data rich and modeling rich, that SABS, because it is at the apex of the standards and conformity assessment system in South Africa, it's long overdue that we get much more investment from the public sector in this institution, which in many respects was state of the art in the 80s and has received far too little capital investment aside from annual fiscal transfers from the shareholder. There's got to be a significant capital investment in the institution if we are going to make it a globally competitive one.
And finally, the relationship with the Competitions Commission. This has become quite an important issue. Has SABS, or is SABS currently engaging with the Competitions Commission to make sure that the standards that are coming out, and particularly when they, through an act of parliament or regulation, become compulsory standards, are not in conflict with what the Competitions Commission's objective is?
Sure. We fully respect and support the Competition Commission's constitutional mandate, especially in circumstances which has been well documented even by the World Bank, where there are structural problems in the domestic economy, including the fact that there are very high levels of concentration, as well as a consequence, significant barriers to entry, especially perhaps for new entrants, including black industrialists who are supported by the Department of Trade and Industry. So we fully respect that, including the new competition bill, which will, if it hasn't already, will soon become an act. However, we think that standard setting is not only a globally accepted practice, which we think is a non-negotiable, it's a globally accepted practice which is accredited, monitored, and the subject of significant oversight, including in relation to our partnerships with ISO and the IEC and so on and so forth, and our commitments to the WTO. So, we must ensure, thirdly, that the standard setting process, either by adapting ISO standards as South African national standards, or simply developing and adopting South African national standards, which take into account the objective realities of South African industrial capabilities and our level of industrial development. That's only not negotiable. We will insist on that, but and I'm sure the shareholder, the Department of Trade and Industry, will insist on that. But where there is room for vested interests to influence standards in a way which is brings anti-competitive outcomes to the fore, we agree. And the best way of ensuring that that doesn't happen is through the participation of technical experts, through the participation of independent experts, through the participation and oversight that SABS brings to the technical committees, and by the management of those processes to ensure that anti-competitive behavior and interventions do not result in anti-competitive outcomes. And that speaks to the fact that we've got to get the technical committees sorted out. We've got to build the requisite capabilities. We've got to get better participation in the technical committees. We've got to ensure that vested interests are not catered for. And because if you are looking after narrow vested interests, not only will there be anti-competitive outcomes, but then there's a danger that you featherbed domestic companies, which themselves then become globally uncompetitive. And so a standard is a voluntary standard for the domestic market, but it also has to be a voluntary mark of high standard for export markets. And so when it doesn't pass that test, then you are sending the wrong signal. You're sending a signal to local producers that it's okay to produce substandard products for the domestic market, but you will not be able to compete in an export market. And that is a critical determinant. A mark which brings with it a high standard of globally competitive capability and standard must ensure that South African companies can compete in global markets.
Thank you very much, Garth. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your detailed responses.